It's a dark and cold night somewhere in the woods of North Minnesota. A feeling of unease holds a grip on your body. Your body is unknowingly warning you for something ancient that stirs. That something is waiting in the shadows, hungering for flesh and for your soul. It's a spirit cursed to wander the frozen wilderness, forever starving and forever hunting for more. You may know fear, but this creature is something worse and far more older than you have ever encountered. And once you hear its cry, it's already too late. For the Wendigo will always chase you, no matter how fast you run. Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video. And it's officially spooky season and I am so excited. I was waiting for this for 2 months. I started preparing the scripts in the end of August because I know it's gonna be a lot of work. So yeah, I'm finally recording the first video and I'm really excited. And last year I made trick videos for you in October, also with a spooky subject, and I really enjoyed making them, even though it was a lot of work. But as long as you love doing it, it doesn't matter. But this year I will spoil you because I'm not gonna make 3 videos, but 5 videos for each week of October, which is also my birth month, so way more reason to celebrate. I already have a list with all the older Halloween specials, so if you want to see more spooky videos, please check that out as well. I will put them in the description. So for the first video of this spooky season, I really wanted to focus on an ancient creature because I already did that with the vampires and the werewolves. And in the video about the werewolves, I already mentioned this creature because they share some similarities. And I also promised that I would take a closer look to this creature, so here we are. Which creature? Well, I already mentioned it in the beginning of the video, but this video is about the Wendigo. And this creature truly scared me, and believe me when I say that I'm not easily scared. And I first learned about the Wendigo when I was playing the game Until Dawn. And it was a plot twist because they didn't really mention that it was gonna be about Wendigos. So it truly scared me, but they also intrigued me because I thought their history and the way they looked was very creepy and interesting. And their evil nature was also something that kind of fascinated me. And I also hardly know anything about creatures that are not from Europe, so I'm really excited to dive into the history of the Native Americans because I hardly do that, and I think it's worth to take a look at it. So I was really looking forward to dive into this subject. And not only because the Wendigo is a chilling creature, but it also teaches a psychological lesson and it has moral symbolism. It also seems like they are getting more and more popular as time passes by. You can see more of them in video games, in films, and of course in books. But why are they so interesting to us? And where did their story originate? What part do they play in the history, and especially in the history of the Native Americans? Let's go and find out, shall we? The Wendigo is a mythological creature or evil spirit that was feared in the north of America and in Canada. Not everybody called them Wendigos, there were different spellings. The most famous ones are of course Wendigo, Windigo, Witigo and Wetigo. It is seen as one of the most haunting figures in indigenous folklore of North America. It comes from the traditions of several Algonquin speaking people, including the Cree, Ojibwe, Sateux, Innu and Algonquin. And my apologies if I mispronounced it, I'm sure that I did. There are many descriptions about the Wendigo and they all vary somewhat. And I could not find all the descriptions, but I could find the description that they all agree upon. The Wendigo's appearance is described as a giant creature with a heart of ice. Its eyes are sunken and glowing red or yellow, and their claws are vicious and ready to capture their prey at any moment. They look like a skeleton hybrid of a humanoid that recently desiccated from the grave. In some cases they resembled an elk, a deer, or a moose-like creature, and if they looked like that, they would also have antlers or horns. Either way, they always seem emaciated, forever hungry and looking for something to stir their hunger. They are tall, they say around 10 feet or in some cases even 15 feet high. Their lips are tethered and bloody, and their teeth were very sharp, which made it of course very easy for them to rip their victims to pieces. If they had skin, it would be stretched tight over their bones and the complexion would be ash gray. Sometimes they would have hairs as well. They looked unclean and their odor was that of decay, decomposition, death and corruption. The Wendigo was seen as the embodiment of gluttony and greed. They were never satisfied after killing and consuming a human. They were always looking for the next victim to still their never-ending hunger. Their whole existence was nothing but chasing prey. They followed human scent, voices and footprints in the snow to track down their victims. They were strongly tied to winter, snow and famine. They roamed during the coldest months when food was scarce and starvation would drive people to desperation. You could find most of them in dense northern forests across Canada and the northern United States, around the Great Lakes, the Rockies and boreal regions. They preferred isolated areas away from villages. They would lurk in the wilderness and resided in swamps, caves, frozen lake shores, desolated trails, and abandoned buildings within nature. They would smell their victims from a far away distance, and they would chase travelers that were lost because they were vulnerable, especially when they were alone. Then they would attack their prey, rip them to pieces, eat their flesh, and leave their body to rot in the snow. There was no way that you could escape them because their speed was supernatural. When humans would grow exhausted after running away from a Wendigo, they could go on and on forever. In some traditions, a Wendigo would grow larger every time he ate. So no matter how many human bodies he ate, he would never be full. And this is why the Wendigo was always looking for new victims. Because if he ate more and more humans, he would become stronger and stronger. And of course, he was always hungry, so he was never satisfied. So we now know about the Wendigo, but how could you become a Wendigo? Well, that depends on the tradition. But in many indigenous stories, it's tied to cannibalism, greed, or possession. The most common belief was that you would become a Wendigo if you ate human flesh, so cannibalism. Especially during the harsh winters and in time of famine, there was a bigger chance that you would become a Wendigo, whether you did it out of cannibalism or just to survive. It was a punishment nonetheless. Survival on the cost of others would strip away your humanity. It was a spiritual curse and a moral warning. In many Alangwai tradition, the Wendigo was also a spirit that possesses people. When you would be excessively greedy, selfish or violent, there was a chance that you would attract the attention of the Wendigo spirit. When the Wendigo spirit would find you, it could take control over your entire body and your mind. There was no way to escape it, only by death. In some stories, a spiritual force or a shaman could curse or mark you to become a Wendigo, especially if you violated taboos in the tribe. You could encounter a Wendigo in the wilderness, and when it chooses to spare you, it could turn you into a Wendigo. Sometimes a Wendigo could visit you in your dreams and possess you via that dream. When you wake up, you would slowly change and never be yourself again. was it possible to lift a Wendigo curse? In many traditions, the change was irreversible. The only way to get rid of the curse was to die. But Wendigos were not easy to kill. You had to burn them or you had to break their icy heart. In some later stories, you were also able to kill them with silver. But they believed that this was included because of the stories that traveled from Europe to Native America, like the stories of the werewolf. As I said in my werewolf video, you were able to kill werewolves with silver objects through the heart. So I think that's where they got their inspiration from. If you were possessed and you were still in the early stages of becoming a Wendigo, there was a chance that a healer or a shaman could drive the Wendigo spirit out of your body. This could be done with a ceremonial ritual where they would sing and purify you. Or when people decided to share their food with you, which was of course an unselfish thing to do, which was the opposite of what the Wendigo did, so this could also save you. But the chance that this would work was seen as very small. If you feared that you would become a Wendigo, it was almost certain that the end of your life was coming near. It was better to avoid the risk and live in harmony with nature and other human beings. You had to share your food, respect nature, and of course, not eat other people, even if you were starving. That way you would never be interesting to a Wendigo spirit to curse you and transform you into one because of your heinous deeds. There are several infamous real-life cases that are linked to the Wendigo legend, where becoming a Wendigo meant the end of their existence. Some of these cases were documented and others were passed down orally. They all tie to the Wendigo Psychosis, like cannibalism and spiritual possession. I have a few notable examples for you, with the most famous one being the story of Swift Runner. Swift Runner was a Cree Indian man who was living in Alberta, Canada, north of Fort Edmonton during the winter of 1878 or 9. And his background was pretty basic. He was a big, tall man and he was well liked. As a young man, he had received a useful Cree education. And after his education, he married and he and his wife got 6 children. He was known as a mild, trustworthy and good husband. And his children meant the world to him. He was a former Hudson Bay Company guide, and during the events that we are going to discuss, he served as a guide to the Northwestern Mounted Police. He was seen as a respected community member, so nobody expected what eventually would happen to him. Winters in Canada were very harsh and this winter was no exception. There was a lot of starvation and misery, especially for the Cree people. The winter conditions were tough and the weather was unforgiving. Perhaps that's why Swift Runner decided to take his family away into the wilderness of Canada. He was very familiar with the land and he had access to the trading posts. Maybe that way he and his family could survive this winter. So Swift Runner and his families took some of their belongings and disappeared into the deep, dark forest. Eventually the cold winter had turned into spring, and the settlement where Swift Runner and his family came from started to have some life again. And one day, footsteps came out of the wilderness into the settlement. It was Swift Runner, but he was all alone. His family members were nowhere to be found. Swift Runner looked very healthy and well fed, but he was acting very strange. His in-laws started to ask him some questions, but Swift Runner wasn't able to give them answers. He was very vague and changed his story several times, especially when they were talking about the lost family members. The in-laws decided to tell the Northwest Mounted Police about the disappearance of their family members and the strange behavior of Swiftrunner. So the police decided to talk to Swiftrunner and ask him about the missing family members. They asked him to show them the encampment where he and his family members were staying during the winter. When they got there, they found a grave with bones of a child. Swiftrunner told them that one of his boys had died of starvation and that he and his wife decided to bury him there. That is of course something that could happen when food is scarce, but in this instance, it did not explain why the whole encampment was filled with bones. They were scattered all around the encampment. This left Swiftrunner no choice and he had to tell the police officers the truth. He told them that he was consumed by a Wendigo spirit that had visited him during one of his dreams. This spirit told him to consume the people around him, which was of course his family members. The spirit was very strong and consumed his whole mind and soul, and of course also his body. And after Swiftrunner had killed and eaten his family members, his transformation was complete. He was no longer a man. He was turned into a Wendigo. And then Swiftrunner was all alone. The Cree people believed this story right away. They believed that the Wendigo spirit was real, but the police did not share the same beliefs. Because they were not Cree. They just saw a man who killed his entire family, which was of course a huge crime. Therefore, Swiftrunner was seen as a murderer who just tried to save himself by telling this story, but it did not matter because he was sentenced to be hanged by the police. And this was tough for the police because Swiftrunner was once one of them. On a bitter cold December the 20th, Swiftrunner was led to the scaffold. He was given the opportunity to speak his last words. He accepted his fate and stuck with his story that he was possessed by a Wendigo spirit. He was hanged, but his spirit lived on, preying on other victims to possess. Then there is another story, once again about a man. And his name was Jack Fidler. And he has another very long, difficult name. I won't use it because I'm sure I'm gonna butcher it. So we will use the easy name for this video. He was also Cree, but he lived in Rupert's Land in British North America. He was a shaman just like his father before him. Allegedly, he was capable to conjure animals, and he was also able to protect his people from spells. He also claimed that he was able to defeat a Wendigo, and he claimed that he already defeated 14 of them, which meant that he had killed 14 people and most of them were women. Of course, he said that they were all possessed by the Wendigo spirit and that's why he killed them. And the Cree people believed him. Although not everybody believed that the Wendigo was a spirit, some people thought it was superstition or a mental illness. In early 1907, 2 members of the Northwest Mounted Police visited the soccer camp at Deer Lake where Jack was the shaman. The police wanted to introduce Canadian law in the North and they had heard the stories of this Wendigo killer. They did not believe in the Wendigo stories. In fact, this was all new to them. Eventually they charged Jack and his brother Joseph for the murder on Joseph's daughter-in-law who died a year before. The story of the murderers who worshipped the devil, which was in this case the Wendigo, was huge across the country. The people demanded that they would be convicted, and the police took advantage of the fame. But before the brothers would go to trial, they were allowed to go outside for a walk. And on September the 30th, Jack was able to escape during one of those walks. He did not want it to be sentenced to death by the police or, in his eyes, by white men who invaded their country. Which of course was very true. So he decided to take matters in his own hand and he hanged himself. They found him later that same day. As of his brother Joseph, he was convicted and sentenced to death. But eventually he was cleared from all his crimes because the Cree people often killed people who were very sick in their encampments because they were afraid that the person would be possessed by the Wendigo spirit. And since the Cree people were not yet under Canadian law, they were free to do so, and therefore Joseph's release was secured. But unfortunately for Joseph, this order came 3 days after he already died in prison. And I guess that Jack would also have been released if he did not kill himself. The final real-life story happened in more recent times. On July the 30th in 2008, which is already very long ago, even though it doesn't feel like that, the 22-year-old Tim McLean took the Greyhound bus from Winnipeg, Manitoba to Edmonton, Alberta. And the bus was full and it was a long way to go, so Tim decided to take a nap. But when he was sleeping, he was attacked with a knife by the person who sat next to him. It was the 40-year-old Vincent Waiguang Lee who suddenly started to attack him. The people in the bus started to panic and the bus driver immediately stopped the bus. Everyone started to flee, but Lee wasn't done with Tim yet. He moved his face towards Tim and he started to taking bites out of it. And when the police questioned Lee why he killed Tim, he told them that God told him that Tim was an alien and because of that he had to kill him. Of course, many conspiracy theory hunters and paranormal researchers claimed that Lee was possessed by the Wendigo spirit, especially because he killed and ate his victim. So many newspapers and other news outlets started to write this story down and connected it to the story of the Wendigo. But what they forgot to mention was that Lee was a schizophrenic, which is, if you don't know, a mental illness that can cause delusional thoughts or it can make you see things that aren't there. And this disease can be very dangerous if it isn't treated. People who are schizophrenic have a very vivid imagination. And just a week and a half before the attack, Lee had read an article about Wendigos in the Toronto Sun. So this probably fueled the fire for his delusional ideas. Eventually he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and nowadays he lives under another name. So these real life stories have a lot in common. And when you hear all this, it sounds like the Wendigo is used for an explanation for insane behavior. And there was actually a condition that was called Wendigo Psychosis. There are even reports from as far back as 1661 that mentioned this condition. When people were in this psychological state, they truly believed that they would turn into a Wendigo. They would crave human flesh and they would fear that they would become a monster. Which was also what happened to Swift Runner, who I mentioned before. Most of the time when people suspected that someone had this condition, they decided to kill that person to prevent cannibalism and future victims. And in other cases they tried to treat the individual. In the Cree folklore it was recommended to feed the individuals fatty animal meat or let them drink animal grease. This would cause them to vomit ice as a sign that the Wendigo part of them was leaving their body. Many people became very suspicious about the Wendigo psychosis as time moved on. And the cases of these psychoses decreased sharply in the 20th century, especially when European ideologies reached the United States and Canada. Life became much easier and there was less famine. Therefore, the stories of the Wendigo became less common. Nowadays, it is believed that this disorder has more to do with deteriorating mind when people nearly starve, or that it is just another psychological disorder like schizophrenia or something similar. The Wendigo was not just folklore, it was a cautionary tale. It represents taboo cannibalism during times of famine. This is something we can hardly comprehend, but in the past there were times when winters were very harsh. Sometimes people became so desperate that they started to eat the weaker people, or in some cases people who already passed away because of starvation. I remember the story of an Uruguayan Air Force flight, the flight 571, and the flight was carrying 45 passengers and crew, including 19 members of a rugby team from Uruguay. The pilot had made an error and struck a mountain ridge. The wings and the tail cone were sheared off. 9 passengers died immediately, but the others survived. One longer than the other. They were stuck on a very cold mountain in the west of Argentina. Some people died of their injuries and others of the harsh conditions. Eventually, 7 of them survived, and one of the reasons why was because they ate the meat of the people who had already died. Of course, this was not something that they were very proud of, but they had no choice. And I guess they probably weren't scared to turn into a Wendigo because this happened in 1972. Superstition was less common because science paved the way for logical thinking. Everyone, including the family members of the people who died, understood why they did what they did. But not even a century before that, things were very different. The people back then believed that it was greedy and selfish to mutilate bodies. And telling people that they would become a creature with a hunger that could never be satisfied could prevent them from doing these crimes. I think if somebody is already dead and you eat the meat of that person, it is justified if you otherwise die. But if you kill someone to survive, it is another story. For me personally, I would rather die myself than kill someone to live. Cannibalism is a horrific thing, but it is justified in this case of the rugby team. Another modern thing I found out about the Wendigo is that there's a lake called Lake Wendigo. It's a small lake and it's located on Star Island in the northern of Minnesota in the United States. The Ojibwe people lived around this lake, and therefore the lake is named after one of their mythological creatures. They would often perform Wendigo ceremonies during times of famine to remind the people to be wary of the Wendigo spirits. Other tribes performed similar rituals for the same reason. In the past, the Wendigo was a real creature, but for modern humans, the Wendigo is a mythological story that sparks our imagination. And I already mentioned in the beginning of the video that I think that the Wendigo is getting more recognition as time passes. But it all started in 1910 when the novella The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood was released. This horror novella introduced a wider audience to the Wendigo. After that, many more fictional stories about the Wendigo were released. One of the most famous novels being Pet Sematary by Stephen King. The Wendigo appeared in Marvel Comics, and the Wendigo is a beloved horror creature on the silver screen. You can see them in Ravenous, Hannibal, Dark Was the Night and Endless. And of course in the game that I already mentioned before, Until Dawn, where the Wendigo is one of the main protagonists. And it's also my favorite horror game ever. So if you haven't played it, please do so. It's very scary, especially if you play it alone. And you can also find them in the game Fallout 76 and in the first-person shooter video game Dusk. Of course, in all these media appearances, the Wendigo has been changed to the Western view. I'm certain that probably none of the producers consulted a Native American on their views on the Wendigo. But do correct me if I'm wrong. So, to conclude this video, the Wendigo is more than just a monster of myth and legend. The story of the Wendigo is used to put a mirror in front of us. It was a cautionary tale for the indigenous people. because fear is one of the most powerful things in the world. The story of the Wendigo has traveled through centuries, first as a cautionary tale, but later to entertain us and scare us. But why are we drawn to them? Do we know the answer to that after watching this video? I think we enjoy the stories of the Wendigo because cannibalism is something we can't comprehend. It's one of the last things we would do as humans. It makes us feel uneasy, but also curious. A love for the macabre, as we say. It begs the question, how far would we go to survive? And that's what intrigues us. Perhaps the Wendigo isn't out there in the darkness of the world, but it's inside us, in the darkest corners of our soul. I really hope that you enjoyed my video about the Wendigo. I really enjoyed making it. Stay tuned for the second video of Spooky Season, which is about another creature, but this time from creepypasta, and it's not something that people back then believed in. And the girls in this story were intrigued by him and decided to kill for him. So that's the next one. I really hope you enjoyed this video about the Wendigo. As I said already, enjoyed making it. I hope you like the decor. Maybe it's gonna change for the next one. And if you know a good name for my skeleton, please let me know in the comments. He needs a name. He doesn't have one yet. And I see you the next week. So not next month, but next week. We have 4 more to go. I really hope that you're gonna watch it. And well, I'm gonna enjoy making them. So I see you later. Have a very nice spooky month. And until next time.